everybody. Hi everybody. This is going to be the economic policy screencast. And really we're basing this on chapter 18 out of the AP Gov Wilson textbook on economic policy. But we'll also pull out some ideas from chapter 15 in the economics textbook on fiscal policy. The main resource here will be your AP Gov book. It's important to note that when we're talking fiscal policy, we're talking about actions taken by Congress and the presidency through budget. So budget's going to be government spending and also taxation, or another word for taxation is going to be revenue, okay, total income to the government. All right, so economic policy includes fiscal policy and a little bit later on monetary policy in this screencast and in chapter 18. Alright, so a quick review of fiscal policy as an intro. These are just notes I'm going to go through here with you and talk to you about. So by definition, fiscal policy, federal government's use of taxing and spending to keep the economy stable. Fiscal policy is a tool, okay? So we're spending roughly $200 million an hour as a government, nearly $2 trillion a year, and that's actually higher now than when these notes were originally published. There's a tremendous flow of money in and out of the economy and has a huge impact on aggregate supply and aggregate demand in the economy. So if you think about supply and demand curves being like at the micro level in individual business, aggregate supply and demand is going to be the same concept, except you're going to be at the macro level. All right, so fiscal policy can both help or hurt the economy. Fiscal policy decisions such as how to spend and how much to spend and how much to tax are among the most important decisions the federal government makes. And these are going to be highly political decisions. This is what causes people to win and lose the presidency. This is what causes political parties to lose control of Congress. And it's going to be policies such as fiscal policy. And of course, we're talking about the federal budget, which is a written document for federal government's revenue. Okay, that's taxes and expenses for the coming year. The federal budget is prepared through a process involving the Executive Branch's Office of Management and Budget, and the Congressional Budget Office. So the President has the OMB. This is within the White House office, and the President employs policy experts, economists, budget experts, mathematicians, actuaries, etc. to help them project not only what the health of the economy is going to be, but the health of what impact budget decisions are going to have. And the Congressional Budget Office, they are a part of the United States Congress. And the Congressional Budget Office has, again, the same professional experts in play, and their job is to what we call score proposed legislation, literally like a test score. And the CBO, or Congressional Budget Office, plays a huge role in giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down, a positive or a negative score on a particular spending bill. So members of Congress want to spend a certain amount of money, and CBO is going to tell them whether or not that's feasible or possible to do so. So in addition, fiscal policy and the economy. So how does that interact? So the level of spending and the level of taxing determined by the budget can help to increase or decrease the output of the economy. Okay? So in fiscal policy, we can have what are known as expansionary policies, and we can have what are known as contractionary policies. Now, for expansionary policies, this could be actions the federal government takes in spending to increase demand, right? Buying more products from the private sector, buying more aircraft carriers, buying more office supplies, buying more General Motors and Ford Motor Company vehicles. All those purchases in the macroeconomy lead to gains in the private sector, which in turn lead to more jobs, right? Because of the expansion of the circular flow of macroeconomic activity. But at the same time, we can also use fiscal policy for what are known as contractionary policies. You might be asking yourself, well, why would the government want to contract the economy? Well, what you don't realize is that the United States has operated for decades, really, under a period of very low inflation. Inflation is a general rise in prices. Inflation is a general rise in prices. And so in the 1970s, you could perhaps ask your grandparents what interest rates were like in the 1970s because inflation was sky high. At any rate, the government could cut back on spending at times to slow the macroeconomy. I don't think this is going to happen anytime soon. It could happen in our lifetimes, but this is something that hasn't been the issue. Mainly, we've been seeing government spending to expand the economy. Okay? So, expansionary fiscal policy is kind of the main thing here. So, it's used to raise the level of production in the economy and encourage growth to aid in a time of recession or to avoid a recession, right? So, two categories. The first way to have expansionary policies, okay, there's expansionary policy A and there's expansionary policy B. So, in policy A, we increase government spending to expand the economy. The government buys more goods and services. Government spending increases aggregate demand, causing prices to rise. Higher prices encourage suppliers to produce more, so firms hire more employees. And an increase in demand yields lower unemployment and an increase in output. Kind of what I just explained above, right? So the first category of expansionary fiscal policy is to increase government spending, and that occurs through the budget. The second way for expansionary fiscal policy could be cutting taxes, okay? So if the federal government cuts taxes, individuals have more money to spend and businesses keep more of their profits. Consumers have more money to spend on goods and services. Firms have more money to spend on land, labor, and capital. These actions increase demand, prices, and output, all right? So for President Obama, we saw tax increases for the upper class, right? The idea was to expand the economy through more government spending. We had a major stimulus package of government spending passed to try and stimulate the economy, okay, to expand the economy. Now we see with President Trump and the Republicans now in control of Congress, we're talking about tax cuts, all right? So we are talking about possible major changes in the tax code. Across the board tax cuts, not just for the middle class, all right? So these are both expansionary type policies that are being debated. I've mentioned in class President Trump, members of Congress. I think maybe on both sides of the aisle, maybe even more Democrats than Republicans per se, would be in support of a $1 trillion infrastructure spending package to rebuild highways, bridges, roads, dams, airports, etc. Okay, investing in the infrastructure. That's all fiscal policy, folks, and it's all being debated right now. All right, then we have contractionary fiscal policy. So contractionary fiscal policy is when we try to decrease aggregate demand and reduce the growth of the economic output, because when fast-growing demand can exceed supply, when demand is higher than supply, what happens to prices? You have more buyers than you have sellers. What happens to prices? Yes, prices go up. So producers raise prices. That's known as demand pull inflation, right? So demand of consumer goods and services. Excessive consumer demand is outpacing supply. So demand is pulling up prices, if you will. Okay, demand pull inflation. And if they cannot raise output and must increase prices, this leads to high inflation. Inflation cuts into consumers' purchasing power and discourages economic growth and stability. So government's all about trying to keep the economy stable. We talked about this in Chapter 2 when we were doing our presentations, our individual group presentations on Chapters 2 and 3. We talked about how this is in economics, of course, we talked about how one of the jobs of the government is stability, all right, trying to promote stability within the economy. That, in part, is what fiscal policy and also monetary policy are about. To keep inflation in check. All right, so contractionary fiscal policy is just the opposite. We can decrease government spending, okay? So it's the exact opposite result of increasing government spending. A decrease in demand will yield a decrease in price, and as a result, a decline in production if we want to keep prices stable. And then increasing taxes is the other contractionary fiscal policy method. It's the opposite result as decreasing taxes. Ultimately, it slows the growth of gross domestic product. And the result, individuals and businesses have less money to spend in the economy, but what that does is slows down the demand chasing supply and should bring prices into a more stable situation. There are limits to fiscal policy. Number one, fiscal policy can be slow to implement because the budget process is very slow. You might want to note that in your notes. It's difficult in changing spending levels because 2/3 of the budget is set by law and is known as mandatory spending. Predicting the future can be very difficult, all right? So judging when it's time to go contractionary, when it's time to go expansionary, those can be issues, right? And accurately predicting business cycles. We might have delayed results. By the time the effect is realized, the economy may have changed again. There's lots of political pressure involved. Taxes and spending are highly political and can lead to gridlock, which we could easily see here with our current situation. And last but not least, coordinating fiscal policy can be a challenge because the federal government may be cutting taxes while at the same time particular states could be increasing their taxes. And so you're paying less at the federal level, but you're paying more at the state level. And sometimes that's a wash. So that's something that just places some limits. That's why fiscal policy isn't the end-all be-all, but it's one tool that can be used. Okay, I don't want to undermine its importance, but it's extremely important, but there are limits. Okay, so maybe you've seen this before in a class, or maybe you've seen it in my class before. This is the U.S. debt clock. You can just Google U.S. debt clock and you'll see these numbers changing literally as we speak. What I wanted to highlight here is here's our current national debt as of the time I took this screenshot earlier tonight. That's on February 22nd, 2017. And our current national debt is $19 trillion, okay? But notice here, this is our current federal spending, okay? We're currently spent $3 trillion in our budget, and we've got our annual budget here, and we've got a deficit of $500 billion, okay? So this $500 billion deficit is the amount of money we are spending extra with this year's budget, okay? And so every year that we incur more deficit, it adds to our national debt, okay? So federal spending, this is how much we've budgeted, okay? So here's our spending side. Over here is taxation, okay? So this is our revenue side, okay? And then therein lies the difference, okay? So we're spending $3.9 trillion. We've taken in $3.3 trillion. The difference there is roughly $500 billion and some change. So every year, budget, remember folks, fiscal policy. Budget is revenue. Budget is expenses, right? And in most budgets, or in all budgets except for the federal budget, revenues have to equal expenses, understand? So you and I, we have a budget. We can't spend more than what we've taken in income, right? So the federal government's different, right? The federal government can spend more than it takes in, and that's leading to these huge national debts, okay? So within our budget, here are some major aspects of the budget. Medicare, Social Security, these are all what we call mandated income security, like temporary assistance for needy families, formerly known as welfare. Okay, these are mandatory spending programs. So laws are in place that mandate we spend certain amounts of money of our budget every year on those items. Defense is discretionary. So it's one of the few areas of the budget that's discretionary, that Congresses from year to year and presidents from year to year, they can adjust that. Okay, so a lot of our budget is already kind of set in stone by law. Hence, the reason why Congresses and presidents have engaged in deficit spending, because we pay our bills every year, okay? We pay our bills to those who we owe, but we're borrowing against, a lot of people say, our future by this skyrocketing national debt. So, where do we borrow the money from? Well, down here, U.S. debt held by foreign countries, about $5 trillion, okay? So we're selling United States Treasury bills and Treasury bonds to investors, huge banks, and to other countries, all right? So here we have our national debt. Over here we have our current gross domestic product. And so oftentimes economists will and government decision makers will say, well, here's our debt, here's our GDP. And so what we would want is a ratio whereby our gross domestic product ratio is bigger than our national debt ratio, but you can see that that's not the case right now, okay? So many would say on both sides of the political aisle that it's time for Congress and the president to get their fiscal house in order and really deal with this national debt. Okay? Fiscal policy. It's all about government spending, government taxation. When we spend more than we take in revenue, we get deficits. Every year that we have a deficit, we have to borrow money from somebody else, sell treasury bills, treasury bonds, and that adds to our national debt. Okay, so the government also tracks our economic growth through the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is an agency of the federal government, and the BEA produces some of the most closely watched economic statistics that influence decisions of government officials, business people, and individuals. These statistics provide a comprehensive, up-to-date picture of the U.S. economy. The data on this page are drawn from featured BEA economic accounts. So this shows us gross domestic product for the fourth quarter and third quarter 2016. So remember, the calendar year is divided into four 3-month quarters. And so for our final quarter, October, November, December, 1.9% growth in GDP. Third quarter, 3.5% growth in GDP. 3.5% is really excellent. 1.9 is okay. We're looking for 3 to 4% growth. Okay? This is good. Okay, to get this information as a government decision maker, we're trying to make decisions about how to grow this, how to expand the macroeconomy, and that's what fiscal policy is about in part. Another article, fourth quarter GDP highlights the increase in real GDP reflected an increase in consumer spending, private inventory investment, residential investment, business investment, and state and local government spending. These contributions were partly offset by declines in exports and federal government spending. Imports, which are a subtraction in the calculation of GDP, increased. So if you remember from freshman year, definition of GDP, gross domestic product equals consumer spending plus business investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. Bam, all right there. So government decision makers are looking to make fiscal policy decisions to promote macroeconomic growth. Expansionary fiscal policies. Expansionary fiscal policies. And so that's where therein lies the big debate between Democrats and Republicans, right? About what's the best way to do it. The general progressive Democrat view is middle class tax cuts, taxes on the wealthiest Americans. Republican fiscal policy viewpoints are generally more neoclassical supply side. The idea that we should cut taxes across the board to promote macroeconomic growth at all levels. Okay, so a little bit about budget politics. So in 2011, Democrats and Republicans couldn't agree on a budget, and they couldn't agree on cuts. And so they came up with the Budget Control Act of 2011. This is also known as sequestration. And somehow I just get a funny feeling that this could be a concept that shows up on the AP government exam. I don't know. I just feel like 2011, it's 2017, it's been 6 years. You would think that there might be something about, on a free response question, something along the lines of budget. Okay? You know, and maybe it's reconciliation with the Affordable Care Act. Maybe it's sequestration with the Budget Control Act. Bear with me here. We're just going to read real quick about sequestration. Interestingly enough, this little fact sheet is coming from the National Council of State Housing Agencies, so an interest group for state housing agencies that sponsor government housing to help people find affordable housing. Anywho, here's what it says. Budget Control Act of 2011. The Budget Control Act of 2011, or BCA, was enacted into law on August 2nd, 2011. The BCA set caps on discretionary spending for FY fiscal year 2012 through fiscal year 2021 and created the Joint Select Committee on Deficit Reduction. Oh, look at that, you guys. Joint Committee, right? House and Senate. Select Special Temporary Committee on Deficit Reduction. You know what I'm talking about? Deficit reduction? This thing right here. You know, deficit reduction, right? National debt, dealing with our issues. Okay, where were we? The BCA instructed this so-called special super committee to develop, and that super committee was the House and Senate committee, super committee to develop proposals that would save $1.5 trillion over 10 years in spending. It mandated that if the super committee fails to propose at least $1.2 trillion in savings over 10 years, automatic spending cuts, called sequestration, automatic spending cuts, okay, called Sequestration will occur. January 2013. Since the Supercommittee was unsuccessful in producing a proposal to reduce the deficit by any amount, sequestration has been taken into effect. Okay? So sequestration applies to defense and non-defense spending. The Congressional Budget Office estimates that sequestration will require cuts of approximately 10% to defense and approximately 8% to non-defense in 2013. Many mandatory spending accounts such as food stamps are exempt from sequestration. Housing and urban development programs are not exempt and will be subject to across-the-board cuts. The cuts mandated by sequestration are a cause of concern both to Democrats and Republicans and to the administration, and that's President Obama's administration. Some proposals to alter sequestration have already been offered to the House and the Senate. However, President Obama has stated he will veto any legislation that prevents sequestration unless Congress works out a deal to reduce the deficit. It is unlikely that any deal to avoid sequestration will happen before the November 2012 elections. And sequestration has been something that has stayed in effect. So it's a budget tool that said House and Senate couldn't get along, we're going to make automatic spending cuts. Okay, so in addition to fiscal policy, there's also monetary policy. Monetary policy is a lot different from fiscal policy. Monetary policy is actions taken by the Federal Reserve to regulate the money supply, to control inflation, and to help stimulate and promote macroeconomic growth. So this is from How Things Work on page 478 in your textbook. And it's a really helpful, quick guide to the Federal Reserve and how it works. Okay? So I kind of want to go through this with you just ever so quickly, and we'll address the Fed and look at the Fed more closely later. But I wanted to just give you the quick rundown here. So I'm going to do a little bit more reading to explain. Okay? So the tools by which the Fed implements its monetary policy. 1, buying and selling federal government securities. Okay? So these are bonds, treasury notes, and other government IOUs. When the Fed buys bonds, it in effect puts money into circulation and takes securities out of circulation. Now remember, realize please, that the Fed is selling these securities to massive, huge banks, huge investment banks that are called primary dealers. Okay, so there's only so many primary dealers that the Fed will do business with. Okay, so these are people who have money. They can help get money into circulation. They can help get money out of circulation. Okay, so with more money around, interest rates tend to drop and more money is borrowed and spent. When the Fed sells securities, meaning it gives out securities, it takes in money, and that causes interest rates to rise, making borrowing more difficult. Okay, so this is also known as quantitative easing. Okay, and quantitative easing has been the policy of the Fed for the last many number of years, since 2009. And the Fed has kept interest rates very low. And one of the particular interest rates that's important is the federal funds rate. This is the amount of interest that the Fed stipulates that banks charge each other to borrow money, because banks borrow from each other all the time. Okay, so by keeping the federal funds rate low through the purchase of securities and getting money into circulation, it's all about increasing the money supply, making it easier for people to borrow money, to have loans, to buy houses, to buy cars, to invest in their business, to expand the macroeconomy. Okay? So buying and selling of government securities is one thing the Fed does. The Fed also regulates the amount of money that a member bank must keep in hand as reserves. Okay? So a bank, as it says here, lends out most of the money that's deposited in it and only keeps a small, it's called required reserve ratio. It only keeps a small amount on reserve. Okay? Everything else is loaned out into the macroeconomy. Okay? So when the Fed raises this required reserve ratio, that's more money that banks have to keep on hand. And when they lower it, it's less money that banks have to keep on hand, and they can loan that money out to somebody else making money. That's how banks make money. Okay? So adjusting the required reserve ratio. Third, changing the interest charged to banks. Okay? So banks want to borrow money from the Fed. So banks borrow money from the Fed to cover short-term needs. Okay? This is called the discount rate or the overnight rate. The Fed can raise or lower this rate, which will have an effect on the money supply. Okay? But the biggie here is that the Fed, through monetary policy, actions the Fed takes to regulate the money supply, This is the biggie, okay? And for the last number of years, the Fed has kept interest rates low. And every so often, the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, like, well, I don't know what's once a month, or I can't remember exactly, but I think monthly, they meet, they talk about the state of the economy, and they decide whether or not they're going to lower rates, okay? And so people sit on the edge of their seats because, as you can imagine, the stock market reacts when the Fed decides whether they're going to raise or lower rates, okay? So fiscal policy, monetary policy, all right? Two very important things to know relative to economics. I realize we're in government right now. We're trying to do some policy work on government and at the same time also integrate economics, okay? So there's going to be an assignment that is associated with this screencast, and that's going to be also listed in Job 7.5. So if you would go to the assignment in 7.5, a little bit of follow-up, you're going to use information you learned here and also use your textbook chapter 18 to complete some work, okay? So I hope this was helpful for you, and if you've been sleeping, it's time to wake up. Have a good night. Bye.